The Caldera Palace was a fortress designed to withstand sieges, natural disasters, and the wrath of spirits. It was an architectural marvel of dark obsidian, reinforced steel, and towering stone pillars. Yet, for all its formidable defenses, it proved entirely inadequate at containing the sheer, chaotic determination of an 8-month-old airbender on a mission. Inside the vast, sunlit expanse of the private royal wing, Prince Zan had decided that today was the day he would conquer gravity. He was currently situated near the far wall of the bedchamber, eyeing the heavy, crimson velvet upholstery of his mother's favorite chaise lounge. At 8 months old, Zan could sit perfectly upright, and his unique method of air scooting allowed him to traverse the thick, golden-threaded rugs with terrifying, frictionless speed. But the horizontal plane was no longer enough. He wanted to go up. Zan placed his chubby palms flat against the rug. With a sharp, sudden exhale, he blasted a tiny, erratic cushion of air beneath his hands, launching himself forward. He slid across the remaining 3 feet of carpet, colliding softly with the base of the chaise. A few feet away, Aang was sitting cross-legged on the floor, entirely abandoning the scrolls of air nomad philosophy he was supposed to be transcribing. He was completely captivated by his son's campaign. Zan reached up with both hands, his small fingers digging fiercely into the thick velvet fabric. He let out a loud, sustained grunt of pure, concentrated effort. His little face turned a deep shade of pink. He pulled, trying to leverage his upper body weight while simultaneously trying to force his wobbly, incooperative legs beneath him to stand. "You've got it, buddy. Come on," Aang murmured, his voice a low, encouraging hum. He shifted his weight onto his knees, hovering his hands just an inch away from Zan's back, ready to catch him the instant things went wrong. "Use those legs. Push." Zan managed to get his knees off the ground. For a breathless, triumphant second, he was suspended, bearing his own weight. He looked over his shoulder at Aang, his wide gray eyes shining with an unmistakable, arrogant pride. But the victory was fleeting. The 8-month-old muscles in his thighs simply lacked the stamina. His legs began to shake violently. Zan let out a sharp squeak of alarm as his knees abruptly buckled inward. His grip on the velvet slipped, and he plummeted straight down, landing squarely on his heavily diaper-padded rear with a soft, pathetic thud. Zan stared straight ahead for a moment, processing the defeat. Then, his lower lip pushed out, trembling dramatically, and he let out a sharp, piercing whine of absolute frustration, slapping his hands against the rug. "Hey, it's okay. That was so close," Aang said warmly, moving in immediately. He offered his index fingers to the baby. "Here, grab on. I'll help you up." Zan looked at Aang's offered fingers. His brow furrowed. With a sudden, startling display of inherited Fire Nation stubbornness, Zan forcefully swatted Aang's hands away. He turned back to the chaise, gripped the velvet, and began the grueling process all over again. Sitting at her ornate mahogany desk across the room, surrounded by ledgers and intelligence reports, Azula watched them. She held a fine-tipped calligraphy brush suspended over a piece of parchment, the ink slowly drying on the bristles. She hadn't written a single character in 10 minutes. Ever since the morning in the courtyard, the morning she had shattered her stoic facade and actually, genuinely laughed out loud at the Fire Lord's expense, Azula had been terrifyingly hyper-vigilant. She was painfully aware that she had let her armor slip entirely. For 19 years, she had operated under the absolute certainty that vulnerability was a death sentence. Fear was control, joy was a distraction. But the terrifying truth was that the cold, isolated, paranoid life she had lived in her father's shadow now felt horribly, unspeakably hollow compared to the chaotic, noisy warmth of this room. She watched Aang hovering patiently behind their son. She watched the way the monk didn't force the child to accept his help, but merely offered a safety net, allowing Zan the dignity of his own struggle. She thought about how Aang had extinguished a hallway of torches just to protect her authority. She thought about how he rubbed herbal ointment into her aching wrist in the dark. She was angry at herself for relying so heavily on his steady, grounding presence. She was the princess of the Fire Nation, she was not supposed to need anyone. But as she watched the Avatar softly cheer for their frustrated son, an undeniable, terrifying realization settled into the marrow of her bones: she did not want to lose this. If someone tried to take this quiet, domestic sanctuary away from her, she would burn the world to ash to keep it. Across the room, Aang glanced up from Zan and caught her staring. Azula didn't immediately look away. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the ambient noise of Zan's grunting fading into the background. Aang looked at her, entirely mesmerized. He had spent the last few days in a quiet state of profound awe. He didn't use the word, love, in his own mind. The concept felt too small, too mundane, too wrapped up in the innocent, childhood crushes of his past to accurately describe the monumental, crushing weight of what he felt for the woman across the room. He simply realized that Princess Azula had become the absolute, undeniable center of gravity in his life. It was no longer just his duty as the Avatar to maintain peace, and it was no longer just the overwhelming gratitude he felt toward her for giving him an airbender. It was her. He felt a desperate, burning, physical need to see her genuinely smile again. He wanted to pry every single one of her fears out of her chest and cast them into the sea. He wanted to be the shield that stood between her and the ghosts of her past. He didn't know what to call this all-consuming feeling, only that it had rewritten the very foundations of his soul. The quiet, charged silence between them was violently shattered by the heavy bronze doors of the private wing unsealing with a loud, metallic screech. Zuko strode into the room. He did not look like a monarch. He looked like a man who had been backed into a corner by a pack of rabid Komodo rhinos. His crimson robes were slightly rumpled, his hair was messy, and his golden eyes burned with a frantic, exhausted panic. Azula's brush snapped against the parchment. Aang instantly abandoned his position on the floor, scooping Zahn up into his arms in a single, fluid motion, his entire posture shifting from relaxed father to coiled warrior. "What is it?" Aang demanded, his voice dropping into a hard, commanding register. "The High Sages," Zuko breathed, dragging a hand roughly over his scarred face. He stopped in the center of the room, looking at his sister. "They outmaneuvered me. They bypassed the royal judiciary entirely and appealed directly to the conservative noble houses." Azula stood up slowly. "Explain." "The head priest invoked the Edict of the First Flame," Zuko said, his voice tight with barely contained fury. "It's an archaic law. It states that any heir whose elemental affinity is in question by the spiritual leaders must prove their worthiness before Agni. The noble houses backed him. They are terrified of an airbender sitting on the dragon throne. So what does that mean?" Aang pressed, holding Zahn tighter against his chest. "It means," Zuko said, looking at the baby with deep, profound sorrow, "that the rite of the Ember is officially scheduled for tomorrow at noon at the High Temple. If Zahn does not attend, the sages will formally petition the court to declare him illegitimate. They will strip him of his royal title." Aang's gray eyes darkened like a thunderhead. "What exactly happens at the rite of the Ember?" "It is a barbaric trial of survival," Azula answered, her voice dropping to a terrifying, deadpan whisper. She walked around her desk, her golden eyes fixed on nothing. "The infant is taken from its parents. They are placed entirely alone in the center of the Sun Ring, a massive, circular trench of sacred flames. The heat is excruciating. A firebending child, operating on pure survival instinct, will subconsciously draw the ambient heat away from their own body, or resonate with the flames." "And an airbender?" Aang asked, though he already knew the answer. The blood was roaring in his ears. "An airbender will panic," Zuko said quietly. "If he cries out and uses his airbending, he will blow the sacred flames out. That is considered a massive sacrilege against Agni, proving he is a heretic. If he doesn't use his bending, the heat could permanently burn his lungs. Or worse." The silence in the room was absolute, deafening in its horror. Aang didn't yell. He didn't enter the Avatar state. The transition was far more terrifying. The gentle, pacifist monk completely vanished, replaced by an ancient, ruthless protector. "No," Aang said, his voice carried no inflection. "It was an immutable fact of the universe. I will tear the High Temple down to its foundations. I will rip the stone from the earth and throw it into the caldera before I let anyone put my son in a ring of fire. Aang, if we refuse the rite, they will use it to tear the country apart," Zuko pleaded, though he looked just as ready to burn the sages alive. "They will say the Avatar is imposing an alien dynasty upon the Fire Nation. It could spark a civil war. Let them fight," Aang said coldly. "They will lose." "Stop." Azula held up a hand. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the rising panic and fury like a tempered blade. She stood in the center of the room, her mind racing, calculating vectors, political fallout, and elemental mechanics at speeds that defied human comprehension. Her brilliance, the very tactical genius that had once almost destroyed the world, was now entirely focused on saving her family. "If we refuse, we look weak," Azula stated, pacing a slow, deliberate circle. "We look terrified. We validate their claim that my son is an outsider who fears the flames of his own nation. We will not refuse." Azula, are you out of your mind? Zuko shouted, his composure snapping. You cannot put an 8-month-old baby in a fire. He can't even stand up. The heat alone will kill him. I will not put my son in danger, Zuzu, Azula snapped back, her golden eyes flashing with lethal intent. Do you think I would let those pathetic old men singe a single hair on his head? The sages want a public display of heat and power to prove his worth. Fine, they will get a display of absolute, terrifying power. But it will be on our terms. She stopped pacing and turned to face Aang. Avatar, Azula said, her gaze locking onto his, intense and searching. How precise is your thermal shielding? Can you manipulate atmospheric pressure to create a localized, sustained vacuum barrier? Aang stared at her, his mind catching up to her terrifying, brilliant stratagem. The anger in his chest shifted, forging into a cold, unbreakable resolve. He adjusted his grip on Zahn, who was currently chewing happily on the edge of his saffron tunic. Completely oblivious to the fact that his parents were planning to hijack a holy trial. Precise enough to walk through an erupting volcano without breaking a sweat, Aang promised, his gray eyes burning. I can pull the heat out of the air before it even touches him. Azula nodded slowly, a dark, predatory smirk ghosting across her lips. Then we attend, and we remind the high sages exactly why they should fear the dragon's blood. Nighttime fell over the Caldera Palace like a shroud. The usual quiet of the private wing felt incredibly heavy, suffocating under the weight of the impending dawn. Zahn had been put down to sleep hours ago. He lay in his pristine bassinet, his small chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm, completely unaware that he was the focal point of a national crisis. In the center of the vast bedchamber, Aang and Azula were lying in the massive royal bed. The physical distance between them had been shrinking by inches over the past 2 months. The invisible wall they had erected on their wedding night was thinner than ever, eroded by shared exhaustion, mutual respect, and the undeniable comfort of another warm body in the dark. But neither of them had explicitly, consciously crossed it while fully awake. Tonight, Azula was staring straight up at the painted ceiling, completely motionless. She was uncharacteristically restless, her breathing was too shallow, too controlled. Beneath the heavy crimson silk sheets, her hands were clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists. Aang lay a few feet away. He turned onto his side, facing her back. He could sense her fear. It rolled off her in waves, thick and stifling. He knew it wasn't fear of the sages themselves, nor was it fear of political ruin. It was the primal, visceral, maternal terror of bringing her infant, the child she had suffered in a locked tower to protect, into a hostile environment surrounded by lethal fire. The tactical brilliance she had displayed that afternoon was a shield, but beneath it, she was a mother terrified for her son's life. Aang couldn't bear the tension radiating from her. I won't let a single spark touch him tomorrow, Aang whispered. His voice was a low, comforting rumble in the quiet dark, designed to soothe. You know that, right? Azula didn't turn her head. Her jaw remained locked. The head priest is a fanatic, Azula replied, her voice incredibly tight, betraying the raw anxiety she was trying to suppress. He has spent his life interpreting the will of Agni. If he suspects a trick, if he notices the atmospheric shift of your vacuum shield, he will try to bypass it. He will try to ignite the inner ring himself. Then I will extinguish the head priest before he can even blink, Aang stated, the absolute certainty in his voice leaving no room for doubt. He moved slightly closer on the mattress. It was a completely intentional shift, closing the gap between them by several inches. Trust me, Azula. The silence stretched. Azula squeezed her eyes shut in the dark. Trust was the most dangerous currency in her world. It had only ever led to betrayal. To trust the Avatar with her son's life in the center of a roaring fire went against every survival instinct Ozai had beaten into her. Aang reached out. He didn't grab her wrist, and he didn't offer a tentative, questioning touch. He extended his arm across the silk sheets and gently, firmly rested his open palm flat against the absolute center of her back, right between her shoulder blades. It was a deliberate, grounding, incredibly intimate touch. Azula stopped breathing. Her entire body went entirely rigid under his hand. She waited for the instinct to strike him, to pull away, to demand he remove his hand. The instinct never came. Instead, the steady, radiating warmth of his palm seemed to seep through her thin silken sleeping robe, melting the ice that had seized her spine. Slowly, agonizingly, Azula exhaled a long, shaky breath. She didn't pull away. With a microscopic movement, so slight it was almost imperceptible, she leaned back just a fraction of an inch, pressing the center of her back firmly into the grounding warmth of his hand. She was silently accepting his promise, anchoring herself to his strength in the dark. Aang kept his hand exactly where it was. He closed his eyes, his heart hammering a quiet, steady rhythm against his ribs, and stood guard over her until the sun began to rise. High noon. The high temple of Agni was a monolithic structure of red stone and gold, built into the side of the caldera itself. The air inside was oppressive, suffocatingly thick with the smell of sulfur, burning myrrh, and heavy incense. The temple was packed to absolute capacity. The tiered stone benches were filled with the elites of the Fire Nation, the noble houses, military generals, and the high sages, all wearing their ceremonial red and gold robes. Zuko's imperial guards lined the walls, their faces grim, hands resting on the pommels of their swords, ready for the political powder keg to ignite. At the absolute center of the massive room was the Sun Ring. It was a deeply sunken, circular trench carved into the stone floor, 50 feet in diameter. It was currently unlit, but the air above the trench shimmered with latent heat. Standing at the edge of the ring was the head priest. He was an ancient man with a long, white beard, wearing heavily embroidered robes denoting his supreme spiritual authority. His eyes were cold and uncompromising. The heavy, towering bronze doors at the back of the temple groaned open. The murmuring of the crowd instantly died, replaced by a deafening, terrified silence. Aang and Azula walked in side by side. They did not look like a diplomatic couple attending a religious ceremony. They looked like gods of war descending to pass judgment. Azula was terrifying to behold. She had donned her full, ceremonial obsidian and gold armor. The sharp, jagged metal plates clicked with every step she took, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, flawless topknot secured by a golden flame piece. Her golden eyes swept over the gathered nobles, calculating the exact level of their fear, daring them to look at her. Beside her, Aang was a stark, vibrant contrast. He wore his formal, flowing saffron robes, the crimson sash wrapped tightly around his waist. The blue arrow on his shaved head was stark against his pale skin. He carried Zahn securely in his arms. Zahn, wearing a tiny, immaculate crimson tunic with gold embroidery, was entirely unfazed by the oppressive atmosphere or the hundreds of people staring at him. The 8-month-old was currently preoccupied with trying to grab Aang's nose, babbling happily and blowing spit bubbles. They walked down the long, central aisle. The crowd parted instinctively, pulling back from the sheer, radiating power of the trio. They reached the edge of the Sun Ring. Zuko stood nearby, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles were white, looking at Aang with a desperate, pleading expression. The head priest stepped forward, bowing shallowly, a gesture devoid of true respect. "Avatar," the head priest announced, his voice echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings. "Princess, the hour has come. Relinquish the child to the sacred stones, so that Agni may judge his inner flame and determine his worthiness to inherit the dragon's legacy." Aang's expression did not change. He stepped over the edge of the trench, descending the short stone steps into the absolute center of the unlit Sun Ring. But he did not put Zahn down. He held the baby securely against his chest. "What is the meaning of this?" the head priest demanded, his brow furrowing in outrage. "The child must face the trial alone. It is the law of the first flame." Azula stepped down into the ring, walking until she stood shoulder to shoulder with her husband. She looked up at the priest, her eyes burning with a lethal arrogance. "The heir to the dragon throne does not face the flames alone, priest," Azula stated, her voice carrying effortlessly to the very back rows of the temple. "We are his blood, we are his shield, we face the judgment of Agni as a dynasty." The priest sneered, his face twisting in disgust at the blatant disrespect for tradition. He raised his hands, turning to the dozen acolytes stationed around the perimeter of the trench. "So be it, let the flames judge you all," the priest shouted. He dropped his hands. The acolytes thrust their fists forward simultaneously. Jets of pure, concentrated fire shot from their hands into the sunken trench. The oil lining the stones caught instantly. A massive, roaring wall of brilliant orange fire erupted from the circular trench. The flames shot 20 feet into the air, completely surrounding Aang, Azula, and the baby in a towering, inescapable cage of intense, blinding heat. The roar of the fire was deafening, drowning out the gasps of the terrified nobles in the stands. The heat radiating from the wall of fire was intended to be excruciating. It was designed to intimidate the Avatar, to force him to use his airbending to clear the smoke, thereby causing a sacrilege and proving the child was a heretic. But inside the ring, they did not burn. The exact millisecond the acolytes had moved, Aang had reacted. Without moving a muscle, without taking a martial stance, Aang pulled the air. He generated a spherical, entirely imperceptible vacuum shield around the three of them. It was a masterpiece of elemental control. He didn't blow the fire away, he simply stripped the atmospheric pressure immediately surrounding their bodies. The crushing, suffocating heat of the flames slammed into the invisible barrier and vanished, dispersed safely upward toward the ceiling. Inside the bubble, the air was perfectly cool. Zahn, resting comfortably against Aang's chest, was completely unharmed. The baby looked around at the towering, dancing walls of bright orange fire. To an 8-month-old, it didn't look like a death trap. It looked like Aang was doing another one of his incredibly flashy parlor tricks with lights. Zahn clapped his chubby hands together, a massive, toothless grin spreading across his face, and let out a delighted, bubbly laugh that echoed strangely over the roar of the fire. Azula did not laugh. She stepped forward, moving slightly ahead of Aang, positioning herself between her family and the wall of flames. She did not just endure the fire. She was Princess Azula. She commanded it. Azula dropped into a sharp, flawless, incredibly deep martial arts stance. The obsidian plates of her armor shifted with a menacing clatter. She extended both arms, her fingers rigid, her breathing perfectly synchronized. She reached out with her kai, connecting with the massive, roaring inferno surrounding them. With a sharp, violent, sweeping kata, Azula violently seized control of the sage's flames. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. The towering walls of bright orange fire shuddered. The color began to shift at the base, an icy, blindingly bright white-blue consuming the orange, racing up the columns of fire until the entire sun ring was burning with Azula's signature, agonizingly hot blue flames. The heat output tripled. The acolytes at the edge of the ring screamed, falling backward, unable to withstand the sudden, astronomical spike in temperature. The nobles in the front rows threw their arms over their faces, terrified. Azula wasn't finished. She thrust her arms upward in a spiraling motion. The blue fire detached from the trench, pulling together, twisting and coalescing into a solid, defined shape. Aang subtly raised his free hand behind her back. He injected a powerful, localized, spiraling updraft of wind directly into the center of her fire. The result was a masterpiece of terrifying synergy. The blue fire took the shape of a massive, serpentine dragon. The air currents provided the structure, making the blue dragon roar with the sound of a hurricane, its massive, flaming body coiling protectively around Aang, Azula, and Zahn. The blue dragon spun with a blinding, roaring intensity, illuminating the entire temple in a terrifying, ethereal blue light, forcing every single sage, noble, and guard to shield their eyes and drop to their knees in absolute awe. In the center of the storm, Zahn was utterly thrilled. The spinning blue lights were the most amazing thing he had ever seen. Acting entirely on his own infant instinct, wanting to play with the pretty lights, Zahn thrust his chubby hands out toward the coiling dragon. With a sharp grunt, Zahn blew a powerful, concentrated burst of air from his palms. The gust of air hit the body of the blue fire dragon. The introduction of sudden, pressurized oxygen caused the blue flames to react explosively. The dragon shattered, flaring brilliantly outward toward the high vaulted ceiling of the temple like a massive, magnificent firework, showering the air above the terrified crowd in harmless, fading blue sparks. The flames dissipated entirely. The sun ring was empty, save for the smoke. Aang, Azula, and Zahn stood in the center, entirely untouched. Aang's saffron robes weren't even singed. Zahn was giggling, extremely proud of his firework display. Azula slowly lowered her arms. She looked out over the temple. Every single person was on their knees, trembling. She found the head priest, who was cowering at the edge of the trench, his ceremonial robes stained with soot, his eyes wide with absolute, primal terror. Azula took a step forward, the click of her armored boots echoing in the stunned silence. Agni has recognized his heir, Azula stated, her voice cold, imperious, and echoing with absolute finality. The flames bowed to the dragon's blood. The rite is complete. She looked down at the weeping priest, her golden eyes merciless. If any sage, or any noble in this room, ever questions my son's legitimacy again, Azula promised softly, I will not be as merciful as the Avatar. You will not face a trial. You will face me. The adrenaline crash did not hit them until the heavy bronze doors of the private wing finally sealed shut behind them, locking out the rest of the palace. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the high windows, casting long, golden shadows across the familiar rugs and furniture. They had won. They had outplayed the entire traditionalist faction flawlessly, solidifying Zaan's place in the dynasty without a single drop of blood spilled. But the victory felt distant. The moment the locking bar fell into place, Azula turned around. "Give him to me." Her voice was tight, strained. Aang didn't hesitate. He gently passed Zaan into her arms. Azula held the baby tightly against her chest. She walked to the center of the room. With one hand supporting Zaan, she began to rapidly, almost frantically, unbuckle the heavy straps of her obsidian armor. The thick, jagged metal plates clattered loudly against the stone floor, one by one. The gauntlets, the shoulder guards, the heavy chest plate, she stripped them all off, refusing to put her son down for even a second to do it properly. Finally, she stood in the center of the room, stripped down to her light, crimson silken undershirt and trousers. But she still refused to put the baby down. She held the 8-month-old desperately tight against her chest, wrapping both arms around him, burying her face deeply into his soft, dark hair. Zaan, exhausted by the heat, the noise, and the sheer excitement of his explosive light show, didn't fuss. He rested his heavy, sleepy head against her shoulder, his eyes already drifting shut. Aang stood by the door, watching her. He could see her shoulders trembling slightly. Despite her flawless, terrifying performance in the temple, despite commanding the blue fire and bringing the high sages to their knees, she had been absolutely terrified. The maternal instinct in her, the primal fear of seeing her infant surrounded by a wall of lethal fire, had nearly paralyzed her. She was coming apart at the seams. Aang crossed the room. He stepped carefully over the discarded plates of obsidian armor scattered on the floor. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't offer a tentative touch to her back. Aang stepped directly into her space, wrapped his long arms securely around both of them, and pulled Azula and Zaan into a massive, encompassing, fiercely protective hug. He pressed his chest against her back, wrapping his arms over hers, burying his face in the crook of her neck, offering his entire body as a shield against the adrenaline and the terror that was currently racking her frame. Surrounded by Aang's solid, radiating warmth, and anchoring herself to the heavy, breathing weight of her son, the very last, most stubborn piece of Azula's emotional armor shattered into a million pieces. She let out a choked, ragged breath. She leaned her head back against his shoulder, squeezing her eyes shut, finally allowing herself to feel the crushing weight of what they had just survived. "I was so afraid," Azula whispered. Her voice was muffled against his collarbone, sounding incredibly raw, stripped of all its royal cadence. It was just the voice of a terrified mother. "When they ignited the trench, I thought I was going to lose him. I had you," Aang murmured into her hair, his arms tightening around her. "I had both of you. I promised I wouldn't let it touch him." "I know," Azula breathed. She turned her head slightly, her cheek resting against his chest. She opened her golden eyes, looking at the wall, her voice trembling with an agonizing vulnerability. "I have never known a father could be like you, Aang." Aang's breath caught in his throat. It was the first time she had used his actual name in months. "My father," Azula continued, the words tumbling out, a desperate confession to the quiet room, would have let the fire burn. "He would have stood back and watched, just to see if I was strong enough to survive it on my own. He would have called it a necessary test of strength." She pulled back slightly, turning in his arms so she could look up at him. Her golden eyes were wide, shining with unshed tears, completely exposed. "You didn't test him," Azula whispered, her voice breaking. "You shielded him. You were a good father to him, Aang." Aang stared down at her, profoundly, overwhelmingly moved by the depth of her confession. He opened his mouth to speak, to tell her that she was safe, that he would shield them for the rest of his life. Before he could form the words, a small, heavy hand slapped flat against the center of his chest. Aang and Azula both looked down. Zaan, who had apparently been woken up by his parents shifting around, wriggled in Azula's arms. The baby looked up at Aang. He grabbed a thick fistful of Aang's saffron robes in his chubby fingers, pulled himself up slightly, and shouted with absolute, joyous clarity. "Da!" Aang froze. The entire universe seemed to stop spinning. The air left his lungs in a rush. Zaan blinked his wide, luminous gray eyes, looking immensely proud of himself. He patted Aang's chest again. "Da, da." Aang's vision blurred instantly. Hot, heavy tears spilled over his eyelashes without warning, tracking rapidly down his cheeks, sliding over his blue arrows. He let out a wet, overwhelmed, breathless laugh that sounded suspiciously like a sob. "Yeah," Aang choked out, his voice cracking violently. He reached down, his hands trembling slightly. Yeah, that's right, Da. I'm Da. Aang looked up at Azula. His gray eyes were shining with tears, his face split into a massive, blinding smile of pure, unadulterated joy. Thank you, Aang whispered fiercely, his voice thick with emotion, his gratitude overflowing its banks. He looked at her like she had hung the moon and the stars in the sky. Thank you for giving me everything. And you are a great mother to him, Azula. You kept him safe today. You commanded the fire so it couldn't hurt him. You're amazing. Aang didn't wait for her to reply. He gently, firmly took Zan from her arms. Aang hoisted the baby high into the air, spinning around once in the center of the room. He pulled Zan down, burying his face in the baby's soft neck, raining dozens of soft, rapid-fire, exaggerated kisses all over Zan's chubby cheeks, forehead, and nose, blowing raspberries against his skin. Zan shrieked with delight. He threw his head back and giggled so hard he dissolved into a breathless, hiccuping laughing fit, kicking his legs wildly in the air, his tiny hands grabbing at Aang's ears. Azula stood in the center of the room, her arms suddenly empty, watching them. She watched the Avatar, the most powerful being on the planet, weeping openly with joy because an 8-month-old baby had called him, Da. She watched the pure, untainted, radiant love flowing between the monk and his son, completely devoid of fear, or expectation, or conditions. Azula found herself smiling. It wasn't a smirk. It was a small, quiet, genuine smile that reached her golden eyes. She felt a warmth blooming in her chest that had nothing to do with bending fire. But internally, as she watched them laugh together in the golden afternoon light, a bittersweet, agonizing shadow lingered in the corners of her mind. Aang had called her a great mother. He had looked at her with such absolute, terrifying reverence. But Azula doubted it. She looked at the pure goodness of the man in front of her, and the innocent, perfect child he was holding. The ghost of Ursa whispered in the dark recesses of her mind, a cold, familiar chill. Her own mother had looked at her and seen a monster. Her own mother had fled into the night to escape what Azula was becoming. Azula crossed her arms tightly over her chest, the smile faltering slightly as the fear crept back in. She wondered, with a sickening drop in her stomach, if she could ever truly shed the monster her father had forged. She wondered if she would ever truly be worthy of the beautiful, perfect family currently laughing in front of her.